You wore your uniform on your wedding day. Shameful. 5 words, 1 message, from a number I hadn't saved in years. But I knew instantly who it was. My father. Colonel Richard Halstead, former 82nd Airborne. A hard man, a soldier's soldier, and a father forever disappointed in his only child. The text burned on my screen as I stood behind the closed wooden doors of the Navy chapel. My heart steady beneath the crisp white of my dress uniform, gold buttons catching the warm light, 4 stars on my shoulders, rows of ribbons across my chest, earned, not given, lined up like silent sentries of the 25 years behind me. Behind me, my teammates stood at ease. Some wore medals I had personally pinned to their chests. Others carried scars that no one ever spoke of, the kind that don't always bleed. And in front of me, just beyond those doors, 200 SE ales waited. At the altar, the man I was about to marry, Daniel Hart. The message burned hot in my hand. I could have erased it in an instant, but I paused. A full minute, not from shock, from clarity. This was who my father was. And this was who I had become. The doors opened. I stepped forward. My heels struck the polished wood floor, each step echoing. At once, every sail in the room rose to their feet. As one, in a single breath, in a single motion. And a voice rang out, sharp and powerful, filling the vaulted ceiling. "Admiral on deck!" The call rolled across the chapel, climbing the stained glass, flooding the solemn space. 200 warriors, uniforms sharp, medals gleaming, postures unshakable. My throat tightened. Not from sadness, from honor. My father wasn't there. But my family was. Perhaps you want to know what led to that moment. The moment I walked into the chapel not in lace and white silk, but in a uniform woven with memory and sacrifice. I was born into the military, not by oath, but by bloodline. My father believed in discipline above all else, duty, honor, obedience. He carved those commandments into stone and passed them down as if they were sacred law, and in his eyes, only a son was worthy to carry that flag forward. When I was 10, he took me to the Army-Navy game. The crowd roared, flags waving like rolling surf. I still remember the smell of smoke and grilled meat drifting through the winter air, the loudspeakers thundering across the stadium. He didn't take me there to enjoy it. He took me there to prove what I would never have. As the band struck up, he leaned down, his voice cold in my ear. "You will never wear those colors." The uniform belongs to men, to those strong enough to bear it. I didn't cry. I never cried in front of him. I just stayed quiet, watching, memorizing. In my room, his medals filled the walls, locked behind glass. I grew up pressing his dress uniforms, memorizing regulations before I turned 16. But when I told him I had applied to Annapolis, he went silent for an entire year. That silence was louder than any insult. The day I received my appointment to the Naval Academy, he threw a manila folder onto my bed. Inside were applications for law school, teaching, nursing. Not one carried the anchor seal. At Annapolis, I quickly learned being a woman in uniform meant walking a blade twice as sharp, for fairness that was only half as much. I worked harder, studied longer, endured more. I earned every bar, every rung of steel. And with each promotion, I called him. He never picked up. Eventually, I stopped dialing. But silence speaks too. Through all that silence, my mother was the one who kept me standing. She was soft where he was stone. A high school literature teacher, she read Emily Dickinson to me at night, called me her storm bird, fierce, strong, sometimes too much for my age. I still remember a dinner when I was 15. I told them I wanted to attend a summer leadership camp at Annapolis. My mother beamed, but my father never looked up from his plate of beans. "You're not cut out for the military," he said. "That's not how we build this family." He spoke as if I'd just announced I wanted to join the circus. But my mother only placed her hand on my shoulder and smiled. "Elizabeth," she said, "storms aren't born to stay still." That line has followed me my whole life. When my acceptance letter to the Naval Academy arrived at 18, my hands shook with joy. I offered it to my father as a kind of peace offering. He glanced at it for 30 seconds, then said, "So you're serious about this nonsense?" He didn't speak to me for 2 months. Not a word, not a glance. He even skipped my graduation party. That was the first time I truly understood. Silence can build a wall thicker than any order. 3 years into Annapolis, my mother died. Breast cancer. Swift, ruthless, leaving no room for hope. My father said nothing until the final week. When I walked into her hospice room, her hair was gone, her skin paper thin. He stood in the corner with folded arms, silent as a sentry. She held my hand and whispered, "Keep flying, Stormbird." She was gone before dawn. I returned to duty right after the funeral, waiting for a call, a letter from him. Instead, there was only an email. "The funeral was fine. Hope the Navy treats you well. I still don't understand your decision." That was all. Over the years, every milestone in my career became a crossroads. When I pinned on Commander, I sent him a photo. No reply. When I received the Distinguished Service Medal, I sent him the link to the ceremony. Still silence. Sometimes I wondered if I should stop waiting, but somewhere inside, a small flame still hoped he might show up, that one day he might see me. When I was promoted to Rear Admiral, the youngest woman in the district to reach that rank, I tried one last time. I wrote him a letter by hand. "I know you never agreed with the path I chose, but I carried every lesson you taught me. I led my sailors with those very values. I did it in uniform, and I did it well." I never got a response, but a friend of his told me he'd read the letter 3 times before tearing it in half. So that morning, when the text came, "You wore your uniform, shameful," I wasn't surprised. It was just the final confirmation. He had never seen me as a soldier, never even as his daughter. To him, I was only a traitor. But there's one truth I've learned. Legacy doesn't flow through blood. It has to be earned. Somewhere along the way, I stopped chasing my father's nod. I built my own altar, not with medals locked behind glass, but with the lives I'd led, defended, and sometimes had to bury. That's what I carried into my wedding day. Not shame, not bitterness, but truth. There's a saying in the Navy, "Smooth seas never made a skilled sailor." I didn't choose the storm chose me, and instead of breaking, I learned to stand tall. So when the chapel doors opened and 200 SEALs rose to their feet in unison, I knew this much. Blood may not salute, but honor does. In that moment, I wasn't seeking approval anymore. I had found closure. After my mother's funeral, everything shifted. Not all at once, but quietly, like cracks spreading through a wall that had already been weakened for years. At home, my father kept his old routines. Shoes polished to a mirror shine. Dinner at 1800 sharp. The television switched on at 2000. but the chair across from him at the table sat empty. Always. My mother's absence turned a house that was already cold into something closer to an abandoned barracks. I returned to my unit carrying that emptiness. Each morning, as I pulled on my uniform, I could still hear my mother's voice. Keep flying. But layered over it was my father's silence, a silence heavier than any shouted command. When I received my first promotion, I tried calling him. No answer. When I was deployed overseas, I sent him my contact information. Nothing. Over time, his silence became the default reply. Once, at a military event, I ran into one of his old comrades. He shook my hand, pride lighting his face, and then hesitated. Your father, he never speaks of you. Not because he doesn't know, but because... He trailed off. He didn't need to finish. I already understood. My father didn't speak of me because, to him, I didn't exist. That night, lying in the barracks under the cold glow of fluorescent light, I allowed myself to cry for the first time in years, not from pain, but from the realization that I had finally stopped waiting. That was the breaking point. I began to see things differently, no longer chasing a nod from that man. I poured everything into the mission, into my sailors. I became the kind of leader I had once wished for, one who listened, who noticed, who made others feel seen when they thought they were invisible. There was a young sailor once, trembling as he stood in formation. I called him over, straightened his collar, looked him in the eye. You're not small. You've just never been seen. The smile that broke across his face in that moment meant more to me than any recognition from my father ever could. From then on, I understood. Family isn't just where you're born. It's the people who rise with you and for you. The night before a deployment, I wrote in my journal, I will not let his silence define me. I will write my own story. That year, I was assigned to Okinawa. My first duty wasn't glorious. Paperwork, logistics, keeping order in a unit filled with men twice my size. Most of them looked at me as a joke. A young woman, hairpin tight in a bun, rank insignia still shining new. In their eyes, I was nothing more than a political token, filling a slot. At first, I endured, grinding through double the work, late nights on duty, stacks of reports, every file in order. But then, one night, everything changed. A soldier was injured in training, his leg broken, blood pooling across the floor. I rushed forward, yanked off my belt, and cinched it tight as a tourniquet. The others froze, hesitating, waiting for orders. I shouted, "Don't just stand there. Hold his head. Call for medevac, now." My voice rang sharp, steady, unshaken, and in that moment they listened. The young man lived. The next day when I walked into the mess hall, the mocking stares were gone. In their place, a few nods. One older soldier murmured quietly, "You're not like the other officers." I didn't answer, but inside, something shifted. I began to see more clearly. Recognition didn't need to come from a silent father back home. It could come from the eyes that had witnessed you act. A few months later, we joined a major field exercise. Tropical rain hammered down like punishment. The men were exhausted, spirits sagging. I walked the line, boots sinking in mud, uniform soaked through, and said, "You think you can't take one more minute, but it's this very minute that makes a soldier." No rallying cry was needed, just one sentence, and I saw them tighten their ranks. That night, I sat down to write a letter home, not to my father, to my mother. She was gone, but I wrote as if she might still read it. Mom, I found my way to keep flying. Not with the wings he gave me, but with the sky I claimed for myself. When I folded the letter, I knew I'd reached a turning point. I no longer fought to be seen by one man. I chose to see others. And that choice is what kept me standing. On my last night in Okinawa, I stood on the ship's deck, sea wind slapping my face, sharp with salt. I whispered, "Silence is no longer a sentence. It's just the backdrop for the voice I choose to raise." Years passed like that. With every promotion, I still tried, sending a message, a photo, a short note. Each time, silence came back. Slowly, I learned to stop waiting. When I was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, I sent him the link to the ceremony. No reply. When I was promoted to Rear Admiral, the youngest woman in the region to do so, I wrote him a letter by hand. I know you don't agree with my path, but I have carried the values you taught me: discipline, honor, responsibility. I've led my sailors with those very lessons, and I've done it well. There was no answer. Later, I heard through an old comrade of his that he'd read the letter 3 times before tearing it apart. After that, I stopped trying. Instead, I built a different kind of altar, not a glass case filled with medals he guarded, but in the hearts of the people who had weathered storms beside me. Every cadet I lifted up, every soldier I saved, every look of trust I earned, each became its own testimony to the path I had chosen. And then, Daniel Hart appeared. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't belong to the rituals of the military. He came from the civilian world, with a calm steadiness and a sharp mind that showed me another kind of strength. He didn't love my rank, and he didn't fear it. He loved me, for every choice, every scar, every moment I fought to stay steady in chaos. Once I joked that maybe on our wedding day I should wear a white dress to keep with tradition. He smiled, shook his head. "You in uniform is the truest thing I've ever seen. I wouldn't want you in anything else." I laughed, then fell silent, because I understood. This was the first man who never asked me to shrink in order to fit inside his love. When we decided to marry, I chose the Navy chapel. Simple, solemn, no bridesmaids, no flowers, just us and our brothers in arms. The SEALs who had fought beside me said it plainly. "We'll be there. We won't let you walk alone." I didn't expect so many would come. I didn't expect tears. And I certainly didn't expect that on the morning of the ceremony, just before the chapel doors opened, my phone would vibrate. A message, from a number I hadn't saved in years, but one I could never mistake. "You wore your uniform on your wedding day." Shameful. No blessing, no apology, just a sentence passed. I stared at the words glowing on the screen, my hand tightening around the phone. For a moment, memories surged back. Silent dinners, medals locked behind glass, the countless times he turned away instead of meeting my eyes. But this time, my heart didn't waver. For the first time, I saw it clearly. That wasn't my truth. It was only the shadow he had tried to press onto me. I slipped the phone into my pocket, drew a long breath, and as my heels struck the polished wooden floor, I knew my choice was made. I would not walk into that chapel with shame. I would walk in with truth. The night before my wedding, I barely slept. Not from nerves. I'd lived through far worse nights, waiting under threat of rocket fire, missions that stretched for days in the jungle, emergency briefings that shattered the silence at midnight. But this night was different. I sat alone in the small living room of the officers' quarters, pressing my dress whites. The iron glowed red as it smoothed each crease. Every stitch, every gold button, every star on my shoulder seemed to whisper its own story. There was the ribbon that had trudged with me through Middle Eastern sandstorms, the medal I earned after dragging a teammate out of gunfire offshore, and the faint scuff on my boots, impossible to polish away, from the day a helicopter went down in Kandahar. I ran my hand across the fabric, eyes blurring, not from sorrow, but from the weight. Tomorrow, I would wear it not just for the Navy, but for myself, for the silences I endured, the wounds I carried, and the men and women who had walked through fire at my side. In the hallway, a few old comrades stopped by. They were retired now, hair touched with gray, but their eyes still carried the same steel. Sergeant Major Marcus Hill, the man who once dragged me from a burning helicopter, laid a hand on my shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said, "you won't walk alone." Beside him stood Sergeant Torres, who had lost a leg in Syria, yet still insisted on running PT every morning. He grinned. "We didn't need an invitation." "We owe you more than that." I stayed silent, nodding. I had led them through hell, and now they were determined to lead me towards something better. The next morning, the sky was impossibly clear. The deep blue above stretched wide, like a Navy uniform unfurled across the base. Through the window, I watched cars pulling up, one by one, in front of the chapel. Familiar faces stepped out, some I hadn't seen in years. Some had stood with me at gravesides, some had only served under me for a few months. But all of them came, standing tall in formation. Inside, Daniel waited in a dark blue suit. He didn't demand, didn't put on a show. He simply stood there, steady, the anchor I could hold to after every storm. At 12:55 sharp, I drew a deep breath and adjusted my shoulders. On either side, Hill and Torres gripped my hands. We said nothing. But this silence was not my father's emptiness. This silence was strength. The bugle sounded. The chapel doors trembled. I squeezed their hands one last time, then let go. My white boots struck the floor in steady rhythm, each step firm, unshaken. These were no longer the footsteps of a daughter chasing recognition. They were the footsteps of an admiral, ready to claim her truth. The chapel doors swung open. Light poured in, warm, golden, cascading through stained glass. For a heartbeat, the space ahead fell silent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I walked forward. Each strike of my boots echoed against the polished wood. Steady, certain, no tremor. And then, like a wave breaking, all 200 SEALs in the hall rose to their feet. No command, no march music. They rose as one, strong, unshakable, as if every step I took touched a memory they all carried. A single voice rang out, sharp and clear, booming through the vaulted ceiling. "Admiral on deck!" The cry ricocheted off dark wooden walls, off radiant stained glass, off the soaring roof above. My heartbeat slowed, not rushed, not choked, just an immense stillness, filling every corner of me. I looked around. Faces I had once known on training grounds, at sea, in combat. Eyes that had gone dark when rounds hissed past their heads. Hands that had trembled on escape ropes. Scars no one ever named. And yet here they were, all of them, standing tall, together. It wasn't for the rank. It wasn't for the 4 stars on my shoulders. They were saluting a life. In that moment, my father wasn't there. But I didn't feel empty, because here, in this solemn place, I finally understood. I had never truly walked alone. At the far end of the aisle, Daniel was waiting, his gaze steady, silent, carrying the message he'd believed all along, that he had only been waiting for me to see it for myself. Hill and Torres escorted me halfway down, then gave a quiet nod and stepped back. I moved forward, alone but not lonely. Each strike of my boots was more than sound. It was a declaration. I had walked the road my father refused to see, and I stood here not in defiance, but in truth. There were no tears, only stillness, and an honor so deep it filled every breath. As I neared the altar, the entire chapel sank into absolute silence. I stood tall, eyes fixed ahead, feeling the weight and the release of this moment all at once, and I knew. I didn't need words from my father. I had the salute of those who had lived and nearly died beside me. And that salute was enough to fill every empty space. When the command "attention" rang out and faded, the chapel returned to silence. But it was a silence unlike the cold emptiness I had known in childhood. This was the silence of respect, of hundreds of hearts beating in unison, choosing to stand with me, not out of orders, but out of belief. I thought of all the years I had longed for a nod from my father, the countless times I waited, sent messages, made calls, wrote letters, all met with absence. And yet in this single moment, I finally understood. Recognition doesn't come from blood. It comes from those who truly see you. Every face in that room had seen me at my most vulnerable. When blood spilled, when exhaustion broke me, when fear closed in, and still, they called me their commander. That recognition wasn't begged for. It wasn't demanded. It was as natural as breathing, forged in fire and in trust. I lifted my head, not in defiance, but in acceptance. I knew my father might still be somewhere, still turned away, still denying me. But it no longer chained me, because here, in this moment, I had enough. I took the last few steps to Daniel. He reached for my hand, no words needed. The calm in his eyes reflected the calm in mine. We stood before the altar, and I knew. My life was not defined by rejection, but by every time others chose to rise beside me. A Navy proverb flashed through my mind. Big waves don't create fear. They create sailors. I smiled faintly, whispering to myself, if I must swim through great waves for the rest of my life, then here is the crew that has proven I was never alone. And before me, the doors to the next chapter began to open. The air inside the chapel grew heavy, as if even the light streaming through the stained glass carried weight. I stood beside Daniel, feeling the warmth of his hand clasped tightly in my white glove. But what filled me in that moment wasn't only love. It was the presence of 200 warriors, all rising together to give me something that could not be bought, could not be begged for: reverence. The echo of my boots still rang in my mind, carrying the rhythm of years gone by. Drills on damp training fields, battles fought in red dust, nights spent on freezing decks at sea. Every step had led me here, now joined by the unified sound of an entire hall standing at once. For a heartbeat, I almost saw my mother. Not with my eyes, but with memory. Sitting in the front pew, cardigan draped over her shoulders, smiling gently, calling me Stormbird. I blinked, holding back the blur, fixing instead on the sight before me. Sals in dress whites, medals catching the light, their postures straight as masts. Once more a voice thundered, "Admiral on deck!" But this sound was unlike any parade ground or inspection. It wasn't scripted, wasn't demanded by protocol. It rose from the chests of men who had once risked their lives under my command, and it struck directly into my heart. Daniel tilted his head toward me, whispering, "They're not saluting your rank. They're saluting you." I couldn't answer. My throat tightened. What surged inside me wasn't the bitterness of childhood, nor the ache of my father's silence, but a rare, unshakable peace. I glanced toward the back row, where an empty chair marked the absence of the man who had chosen not to come. But for the first time, I didn't feel the hollow sting of it. I realized his absence could never outweigh the presence surrounding me now. In that radiant light, the truth came quietly. I no longer needed a single word from my father to affirm my worth, because here, 200 men standing to their feet had given me the greatest salute of my life. The sound of wooden chairs scraping in unison was like waves crashing suddenly against stone. Light streamed through stained glass, glinting off shoulders and ribbons, creating a shimmering sea of color. No sound but the steady rhythm of 200 breaths and the echo of silence itself. I walked the carpeted aisle, each strike of my boots sinking the past beneath me. The rejection in the living room, the tears when my mother was gone, the final letter met with silence. All of it gathered, not to crush me, but to dissolve beneath the certainty of my steps. To my left, Hill adjusted his coat, his gaze proud and unflinching. To my right, Torres walked steady on his prosthetic, stride firm, undaunted. They said nothing, yet their presence was proof of what I had always believed. True strength isn't born to those given everything. It's forged by those who stand tall despite all they've lost. As I drew closer to the altar, the call rang out again, deep and resonant as a bell. "Admiral on deck!" No longer a command, a hymn. A recognition no written record could ever capture. I paused for a breath. Jasmine from the floral wreaths mingled with the polish of the wood, a sweetness heavy enough to taste. My whole body seemed to drink in the weight of the moment. Daniel stood at the altar, eyes bright, hands clasped behind his back, posture calm, as if he too was saluting me in his own way. When our eyes met, the noise within me stilled. I no longer needed to prove anything. The chapel held its breath. Only the sound of my heartbeat remained, steady, blending with hundreds of others. The moment stretched endless, as if the world had stopped to make space for a single truth. I had been seen. No other words were needed. The chaplain opened his book, then paused. He looked out across the chapel. No one moved. No cough, no shallow breath. The silence wasn't empty. It was weighty, luminous, sacred. Daniel stepped forward, his hand closing around mine, white gloves pressing together. He leaned close, whispering just for me. "I don't need vows to know. I've long been married to your courage." My vision blurred, not from weakness, but from something deeper, belonging. When the vows were spoken, we kept them plain. I promised to guard not only Daniel's body, but his peace. He promised to shoulder every weight with me, never asking me to shrink. Not richer or poorer, not sickness or health, only this: when duty called, we would answer together, and when it didn't, we would find meaning side by side. I now pronounce you husband and wife. No roar, no immediate applause, only stillness, so deep I could hear my own breath. Then, a surge of clapping, fierce and clean as surf breaking on shore. We walked out beneath the arch of crossed swords, steel flashing in the spring sun. The tradition was meant for officers, but today it was my sailors, those I had once led, who lifted the blades. That made it holier than any ritual. As the last sword lowered, I lifted my gaze to the sky, clear and endless. No longer the shame my father tried to bind me with. No longer the silence that had weighed on me for years. This was true recognition, a legacy not of blood, but of trust. And in that moment, I knew I had crossed a threshold. This was more than a ceremony. It was proof that I would never have to walk alone. The wedding reception quieted as the night wore on. The cake had been cut, the toasts delivered, the laughter thinning into soft goodbyes. I stepped outside, breathing in the cool air. The moon hung low, laying a silver path across the water. Daniel followed, standing beside me in silence. He knew silence could speak louder than words. "Did he send a message?" he asked gently. I nodded, then whispered, "He called it shameful." Daniel didn't react right away. He only looked at me, steady as he always had when I returned from deployments. Finally, he asked, "Do you believe that?" I looked down at the white uniform, the gold trim, the rows of ribbons glinting under the moon. I remembered the scrape of chairs, 200 warriors rising in salute. I remembered their eyes, unflinching, unconditional. And I said, quietly but firmly, "No. I don't." There are moments that define a life. Some arrive with medals, some with silence, some with nothing more than a single message. But then there are moments that arrive in a chapel full of warriors, men who did not have to stand, but stood anyway. 3 days after the honeymoon, a photo arrived from my cousin. No caption. It showed the chapel parking lot, taken from across the street. In the corner stood a rigid figure I knew at once. Colonel Richard Halstead, in dress uniform, arms folded, back straight, eyes fixed on the chapel. The next photo, taken seconds later, showed him turning away, leaving. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't know what I was waiting for: regret, tenderness, closure. All I saw was a man who chose distance over redemption. From behind me, Daniel whispered, "He came." But he couldn't stand. The words lingered, because I knew when 200 sails rose for me, my father turned his back. Weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived. The script was familiar, severe, but shakier than I remembered. I didn't walk in because I didn't know how to sit among men who saw in you what I refused to see. I didn't salute you, not because you were unworthy, but because I no longer knew how to honor what I couldn't understand. I was wrong. If you'll allow it, I want to talk. No uniforms, no ceremony. Just a father trying to know the daughter he never let himself know. I read it 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't burn it. I simply sat still. When Daniel came home and saw me still holding the letter, he asked, "Will you meet him?" I shook my head. I don't owe him that. He laid a hand on my shoulder. No, but maybe you owe yourself the chance to choose. A week later, I met him at Arlington, by my mother's grave. The grass was neatly trimmed, the breeze was soft. He wore civilian clothes, no ribbons, no rank. Just an old man, smaller than I remembered. I stood tall in my dress whites, 4 stars gleaming. Not to prove anything, simply because this was who I was. He didn't try to hug me. He didn't force words. He only said, "You look like your mother when you stand that way." We spoke of grief, of the silences we once mistook for strength, but which were only fear. And before I left, he stepped back, straightened, and in a slow, imperfect but genuine gesture, he raised his hand in salute. It struck deeper than any medal I had ever received. I returned the salute. Not because he had earned forgiveness, but because, at last, he had chosen truth. That night, lying beside Daniel, I whispered, "He saluted." Daniel didn't ask for more. He just took my hand, letting silence become the answer that said everything. Many believe revenge means crushing what once crushed you. But I had learned, the deepest strength doesn't live in destruction. It lives in acknowledgement. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't forcing someone to their knees, but watching them stand, even belatedly, and knowing you never had to bow. 6 months later, I received a call from the Department of Defense. They wanted me to oversee a joint service project, rebuilding training protocols, weaving in ethical leadership. 20 years ago, I had dreamed of such an opportunity. Now, it wasn't a dream. It was a legacy I could build. On a return to an old base, I met a familiar name, Corporal Avery Patterson. She told me she'd been named after me, and now wore her own boots. "I enlisted because my dad said you saved his life." In that moment, I understood. Sometimes you don't realize your impact until it circles back and salutes you. Months later, I was invited to speak at a major leadership conference. I told them, authority doesn't lie in the loudest voice. It lies in calm amid chaos. And respect, it isn't inherited. It isn't passed down by blood. It's built when we show up, when we stand tall, and when we do what's right, even when no one is watching. The entire hall rose to their feet, applause thundering. A year after my wedding, I stood on stage receiving the Excellence in Ethical Command Award. Daniel sat in the front row. And in the farthest corner, I saw him, Colonel Richard Halstead, standing, hand raised in salute. In that moment, I no longer saw rejection. I saw a man, at last, learning to face the truth, however late. After the ceremony, I received a message from one of the SEALs in my unit. Never seen so many warriors cry at a wedding. That was the day we realized something. Blood may not salute, but we will. I typed back, "There are gifts that can never be returned. But there are salutes that will last forever." If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect. Who stood for you when others would not? And when did you rise beyond what once tried to break you? Share your story. And if you want to keep hearing journeys of resilience, truth, and quiet triumphs, hit subscribe. Because we only truly rise when we stand tall, together.